Okay, so I just want to welcome you both to our interview here of interventions in the field of visual studies. And I'm just so delighted to speak with you both today, Hana Nikčević and Tara Allen-Flanagan, both studying at McGill in Montreal. And I hope it's not too cold there right now. It's kind of okay here in California, but imagine it's pretty chilly up there. So,
Covering, it's quite nice.
is it good? Oh, good. Excellent. Great. So, one of the first questions that we wanted to ask both of you, either of you, is basically what led you to the subject matter that you wrote about for this volume of the journal. What are your research interests broadly? I have a feeling this isn't necessarily your sort of interest area for either of these essays.
Tara, do you want to go ahead? Oh, sure. Yeah, I guess so. My research interest is, I guess makeup would be what I'd say. I like looking at depictions of makeup in visual media, how it's represented, what that says about the context behind the work that was created. So for this article in particular, I was looking at 16th century depictions of makeup, and everywhere I was looking, I kept seeing things about Queen Elizabeth and her makeup, and I was like, did she actually look like that? Like, are these paintings legit? And so when I was researching it, I found that the general consensus was that the paintings of Queen Elizabeth were accurate. Like, this is what she looked like in real life. And I thought, is that true? Delved into it a bit more, and thought, why would an artist create a painting of a queen who is supposed to be naturally beautiful and forever youthful and have the body of the country? Why would they depict her wearing such obvious makeup? Like, there's something going on there. And so throughout my research, I kind of happened upon the political moves that Queen Elizabeth I was making while these portraits were being painted, and found that she was making big colonial moves in America especially, but also engaging in conflicts with the Spanish Armada and creating like racist proclamations as well. And thinking, so the visibility of her makeup is very tied in to these colonial efforts. Where's her makeup coming from? How is it getting to England? And everything just sort of happened from there.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, so what I wrote about for this paper was Caravaggio's Head of Medusa. And I guess I arrived at this topic sort of through two pathways. The first was this seminar that I took with Tara at McGill. We wrote these papers for the same class. And it was to do with, it was to do with the so-called early modern moving image. And the painting that I discussed was sort of the lead image for the class, basically. So we only considered it very briefly in the context of Maria Lowe's idea of early modern horror as a lens through which to look at early modern art. But a little later, we were reading Carolyn Van Eck's Art Agency, a Living Presence, and I was struck by this idea that Medusa's reflection had the power to petrify and of its myth, because as I recalled, it was conversely precisely the fact that Perseus had viewed her reflection in his shield that allowed him to stay safe from her gaze and decapitate her. So I thought, okay, I should look into this more, and it seemed that, interestingly, it was in fact the case that the idea of Medusa's reflection retaining the actual Medusa's petrifying powers was a 16th century invention. So I thought, how can I tie this in with the visual culture of the time? And my familiarity, meanwhile, sort of with the myth, and the reason there's this big Greek pot element in the paper is that I had this really outstanding professor of ancient Greek art at the University of Toronto in my undergrad, Sung-Jung Kim, and she suggested that I read about sort of Greek vases with eyes on them, and ever since then I've been obsessed with Greek vases with eyes, but sort of her approach to matter was phenomenological experience of viewing, Greek visual culture generally, but those are sort of like the broader themes that I wanted to look at both of these periods and instances of visual culture through, like the phenomenological experience of a work of art or object, and then the sort of the common idea of the painted gaze in both of them. But no, it's not even a little bit my sort of main thesis thesis research topic, which is to do with contemporary ecological art and, you know, looking at how contemporary ecological artists talk about ecological loss as beyond representation. And I'm sure if I tried really hard, I could tie these two together, but I don't think it's really related.
Right. Well, you both did such a wonderful job. I was just curious also, what kinds of questions did you find yourself asking while you were composing both of these essays?
Yeah, I guess the questions that I found myself asking was, first of all, why is there so little written about these official portraits recently? I guess I always overestimate how many people are super interested in makeup. But I noticed, like, why is it mainly English literature scholars who are commenting on depictions of Queen Elizabeth? What's going on there? Mm-hmm. How did sort of political ideologies and even political edicts influence the way in which the works that I was studying were written about? Like, how much can I trust my sources? Which is what led me to the answer to why are mainly English literature scholars writing about this. And one of the big questions, I guess, that I tend to come across in my research is why when you were painting an image of a woman, why make it obvious she was wearing makeup at all? Why not just show her as a natural beauty? Then what is natural beauty? How does that tie in? And so this was a really interesting project to ask those questions on which to ask those questions, because the portraits that I was studying were just so stylized in general. Right. And so why did people look at the face of the queen and think this is what she looked like, while also saying in the same breath her waist was shown as 5 inches wide because it was a stylized representation?
Right. Kind of counterproductive, I guess.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, no, the idea of sort of being able to trust one's sources, I think, was also kind of the dubious point that I also kept sort of running into. Because I guess the thing that I was, originally confused about was really why there seemed to be this frequent misinterpretation of, what is obviously a very common myth and, right. A very common source that is, in many cases, identified as the sort of thematic basis of a lot of art from that period, like this idea of metamorphosis and the sort of movement between or conflation of art and nature that is frequently sort of thought to underpin a lot of the artistic ideas and motivations in that period. It seems strange to me that there had not been sort of, I guess, more rigorous scrutiny of what was being written about those myths. But yeah, I guess in addition to that, I think sort of a larger, I guess the real large methodological question is like the extent to which you can really speculate about an artist's motivations in terms of how they're thinking about the phenomenological experience of their work and how it might link to the narrative that is attempted to be communicated through the painting. And that's sort of, to what extent can you really guess what someone was thinking any amount of years ago if there's no written record, which, that's the classic problem of art history.
Right.
But I know it's, I think there's still value in speculation in a lot of cases, even if it gives you just a creative way to look at something, I guess.
For sure. Thank you.
And I think both of you, the way you answered that question as to like what kinds of questions did you find yourself asking during your research and the writing, the way both of you identified these like blind spots in art historical scholarship on these topics, or just trends you notice in the way these objects are normally or have been talked about, and the kinds of questions other scholars are asking, is one reason we were really struck by both your pieces, and which is the reason we've kind of named this panel Interventions in the Field of Art History, because I think both of you are really asking new questions about subject matter that might be, I don't know, more common, I guess, in art history or something, like Elizabethan portraits, for instance. Lots of people have written about that, but they're not asking the same questions you are. So that's why we're really excited to have both of your pieces in the volume. And another commonality between your two contributions is that they both deal with, in one way or another, with gender and with female, the images of the female body or the female face in particular. Mm-hmm. And so our other question for you is how do you see gender operating in these histories, but also in your research questions, in your methodology? And some of that appeared in your pieces in the volume, but we were wondering if you could both elaborate on the role of gender in both your pieces.
Yeah, I think that this one was, the question of gender was very unique in this, looking at the artworks of Queen Elizabeth, precisely because she was a female ruler in a legacy of men, but she leaned into this myth of the masculine sovereign body, of the body of, was that famous quote, like, I don't even know if it's a real quote, but like, I might have the body of a woman, but I have the spirit of a king. I've completely butchered that. Okay. But that notion of the ruling body, the ruling part of your body being male, and then the feminine part being a detriment, was something interested to work with in portraits, because when you compare portraits of Queen Elizabeth to other, like her predecessors and successors, they're clearly not wearing makeup. From whatever, however you want to analyze makeup, if you agree with my reading of it or not, like their skin tones are not stark white masks. And so that, when I was looking at the gendered aspect of that and thinking the way that women were treated for wearing makeup in the Elizabethan era is different than the way that Elizabeth was treated for wearing makeup, because whatever she did was considered untouchable. You didn't criticize the way she looked. Right. So if that's what she was doing, fine. But at the time, as I wrote in my paper, women were being, throughout the history of women wearing makeup, told that they're artificial, immoral, trying to make themselves a different race. Like there's a lot of, like Kim F. Hall talks about that a lot, about like there's very racist discourses going on about face painting at the time, but the Queen was just exempt from those. Mm-hmm. And if she wasn't, then people wrote anonymously, and took on, and it always had a political angle, which was fascinating.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Kind of reminds me of like the sort of rhetoric around what Michelle Obama would wear and things like that. Yeah, it's just sort of strange.
Yeah, it's the idea of, the politicizing of what women wore and the way they looked and their age. Especially, I was really also interested in like women's aging and how that's depicted, because I tend to find, at least through the portraits I've looked at in art history, just generally throughout the years, older women tend to be depicted either as not wearing makeup or as wearing a lot of makeup, in a more critical way. And so a lot of those dialogues get really hammed up when it comes to women in positions of power.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, speaking of women in the political context or in positions of power, that's I think that's probably the most recent context in which the gendered implications of Medusa as a symbol have been discussed. Popular classicist Mary Beard, I think a few years ago, wrote this sort of book, I think, and then did a few lectures related, I think, about how we view women in positions of power. But part of this was it mentioned this example of how the image of Perseus beheading Medusa was brought back into the contemporary political context, to sort of depict images of Hillary Clinton and Trump, and was used by regressive people, progressive political views, to make their statements in this sort of mythical, symbolic way, and outside of just sort of the overt communication of the myth with Perseus, just images of Medusa were also used to make comments on other political figures such as Angela Merkel. So yeah, it is interesting that this sort of figure that has long been theorized as a threatening example of feminine power, Freud also famously likened the whole story to castration, naturally, it's interesting, but it persists in this. You can't get rid of it. And it really, I think, speaks to, I don't know, I remember being in sort of this class about Roman history a little while ago, and the professor was sort of saying that we think we're so progressive, but, because women couldn't vote in ancient Rome, but, they only got the vote here pretty recently.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's, the same issues through so many years. But, yeah, and, even closer to the time of the painting that I'm discussing, the Dutch or Flemish art theorist Van Mander did this sort of allegorical interpretation of the myth, where he also discussed it as, Perseus being the rational human overcoming the monstrous female, who was likened to, she had the emotions and like the passions that are not simply human, but also those that are shared with animals. So this whole idea of Medusa with the snakes also has that classic connotation of, women as nature and, the part of the human that you're trying to discard that is not appropriate for a position of power, for example. So yeah, it's, it's throughout the past 2,000 years, kind of the same story, I guess.
I was also really curious with your essay, Hana, about how men would have viewed these kinds of images, because you mentioned the castration sort of fear, but it seems to be quite palpable, this fear of women, really, in these paintings.
Yeah, they're definitely gory, that's for sure. There isn't that much in the way of records of contemporary men's or women's, more obviously, reactions, but there is Rubens's slightly later painting of Medusa, also decapitated, also very bloody, lots of snakes. There is a sort of account of someone sort of recalling Constantine Huygens looking at that painting, and one thing that he sort of notes is that you can tell that she was quite recently a beautiful woman. And I mean, it's a dubious reading, I think, looking at the painting, but it's interesting also in how it sort of also departs from the myth, in the sense that sort of Medusa's origin story, according to Ovid, is that she was a beautiful young woman who was raped by Poseidon in the temple of Athena, and then Minerva, and cursed by Athena/Minerva to have this fatal gaze on this head of snakes. And so in her moment of death, she would not have, in fact, actually been recently a beautiful young woman. It's just sort of this way that she's painted. And I think sort of more recent interpretations of Huygens' comment are that, because she's painted beautifully, it's intended to sort of emphasize or intensify the effect of empathy, I guess, in the viewer, so that you can in some way also maybe sympathize with her. And he sort of comments on the terrible beauty of the painting. So, in some way you could think about this, I guess, potential beauty in the head of Medusa as trying to create sort of an interesting contrast in the painting. So it's not just gore or just horror, but yeah, it is, beauty as something to enhance empathy is its own complicated discourse, and certainly it is related to the idea of a beautiful young woman being raped, and then that turns her ugly. That's its own narrative also that persists today, right? So
yeah, thank you.
It's fascinating. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
I was going to say as well how I think both of Hana and my papers deal with sort of these legendary figures of women who over time are depicted in artworks, and the actual context of the image or the story behind the image ends up getting shifted to the point where the story told in the image becomes the truth. Especially, I was thinking of like even in movies where Queen Elizabeth is depicted, you'll see the actresses putting on white face paint, and like they make a big deal out of showing this cosmetic artifice that is arguably based solely on paintings that themselves were only based on the edicts of a queen.
Right.
And with Medusa, I remember talking to Hana about that myth and sort of thinking like, well, wait, what is the original myth?
Right.
What, like, is it her reflection? I don't think so. But the fact that that question's even coming up because of artistic depictions was something to think about.
Yeah, it's really amazing how the art sort of makes it real or makes it true. It's very interesting. Thank you both. And Can we ask you what drew you to submit to Refract?
I can go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, I guess when I saw the theme of hauntings and tracings, I thought that fit very well with the idea of looking at the material history of things depicted in a painting, more specifically the origins of pigments, the origins of makeup, of objects someone is portraying as hauntings and as traces, that are not necessarily the primary focal point of a piece of visual media, but that nonetheless have their own histories. I thought that was relevant.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I thought that was amazing.
I'd say also it was, sorry. No, I'd say also that it was just the theme that I thought was, that was what sort of led me to want to get involved. Because, I guess obviously what I do in this paper is I sort of consider how ancient ideas and narratives, as well as potentially like ancient visual tactics, might reappear in the art of a period like 2,000 years later. So yeah, it was this like sort of trace or haunting, intentional or otherwise, of past production. Yeah, that I thought would be a good fit with your journal.
Definitely. And how do both of you think that this particular piece of work that you've submitted to Refract fits into sort of this broader field of visual studies? I know I myself sort of consider myself a fairly traditional art historian, so thinking about that is sort of complicated, but if you could just say a few words about that.
Yeah, I guess normally in the work I do, I think I look at a lot of different forms of visual media. I look at a lot of advertisements and like line illustrations and instructional manuals about chemistry. But in this one in particular, looking at paintings as historical documents, I guess more than, well, not also artistic representations, but I feel like the visual studies component comes in and analyzing the intent behind the type of visual on display. Like the fact that it wasn't just a portrait, but it had some sort of external purpose, a politically motivated painting, if you will, seemed relevant.
Definitely.
I think, if you think of like visual studies as something that sort of was developed because it was like looking to move past hierarchies of object type, that's probably sort of what I was trying to do, like considering well-made ancient tableware alongside early modern oil painting, and suggesting that they function visually in similar ways, which is related to, I guess, the sort of phenomenological turn, if we can call it that, in ancient Greek art. But I think as well, the objects that I wrote about were not solely things that are perceived visually, but as I suggested, they're also things that are self-consciously about vision and about how specifically a textual narrative could be communicated visually. So, I think they're like, I guess, meta-visual objects, but, that would be an interesting way to consider them.
Yeah, I think both of your pieces captured that aspect of visual studies so well in terms of really expanding what we can, like you were saying, Hana, with what we can even consider to be an object like worthy of analysis or comparison, but also thinking more broadly, more critically about visuality and vision. And I think both of you did that really well in your pieces, and we were so happy to have you contribute pieces that are, again, going back to the beginning of our discussion with what kinds of questions are you asking, what are some new questions we can ask, and a lot of it comes down to like thinking about the politics of vision and visuality in these different contexts. So we were really happy to include your pieces in the journal. And I just want to ask another question. Just because we're all four of us are graduate students, and so we occupy a really unique position in itself. It being like having published as grad students in a graduate-run journal, and so I'm wondering if you see kind of your role as a graduate student as part of a bigger project to kind of, I don't know, really foreground these more political, contextual questions about visuality and vision. And I'm just curious how you've kind of come to be asking these questions just in your graduate program, and if you feel like in your program there's like room to ask these political questions, because your MA program is an art history program, am I correct? And then Maureen and I are both in a visual studies program. So like we hope that these questions are like built into the program. But in like a master's program in art history, for instance, I'm just curious what your experience is with pushing these questions of art history a little farther and more politically engaged, really.
Yeah, I guess I found as a student looking at older artworks that have already been written about a lot. Like my thesis project is on the Impressionists, like talk about ground that has been covered. And so I think that if you're going to be studying art history, that images, paintings that people have already looked at before, you need to be asking new questions, and you need to be looking at these paintings within our context, like what, not necessarily applying today's context to the artists who are painting them, but thinking how can we think of new questions that people wouldn't have even bothered to have asked in the 70s or the 90s, like when the paintings I was studying were being written about in the 70s. It was insane to just be looking at these pictures in the first place because no one had done it before. But I think that in our program in general, we're definitely encouraged to take more critical takes. I think the fact that both of us ended up intervening in our historical foundation sort of points to that. And we're definitely encouraged to think, if you're going to make an intervention, think about why you're making that intervention. Hana, I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, we definitely, I think in the methods course of our program, when we were sort of discussing idea generation and how to write about your area of interest and how to, make it sound like frankly, like something a funding body would want to fund. The idea was, you find the lacuna in the scholarship and you identify why it is worthwhile to fill that gap with your own work. So I think, as Tara was saying, often that thing that is unfilled is sort of the view of whatever artwork in question. What am I saying? The political view of the artwork in question, or one that sort of ties it into discourses that have been developing more recently. So like Tara's, for example, is, obviously, not topical now. It's long been topical, but, it is something that sort of takes a very traditional art object and meets very, very current questions. I wouldn't say that mine is sort of political really in that way. At least, I think it could be taken in that direction, but I didn't really. But certainly with my thesis research, it is something that is, always inherently political, about political ecology, and that's sort of inherent to studying contemporary art. It is quite frequently, not always, but quite frequently political in nature, and that has been a change for me. I feel pretty lucky to be, in a program working with a supervisor and someone, or then, having an undergrad experience that's, led me to that point where I am able to study art history and at the same time deeply sort of look into the political situation to which these artists are responding. And that's been, it feels like a privilege to be able to write about that, really, because it feels like you're doing something sort of worthwhile.
Right, for sure. I just want to thank you both so much for your time and your thoughts today. Tara Allen-Flanagan and Hana Nikčević, both from McGill. We're very happy to have had you in the volume, and hopefully you will